This is Jonathan Yates. We're here today to talk about the culture of sports with Representative Stephen King, the Dean of the Iowa Delegation to Congress. Representative King, thank you for taking the time today.
Really glad to be here, Jonathan.
Well, I taught at the University of Iowa last semester, and the one thing I came to realize rapidly is that people in the Midwest love to brag about how humble they are. Now, last week, U.S. News and World Report selected Iowa as the best state in the country, so something's working. As the Dean of the Delegation, what's that special sauce in Iowa?
Well, there are many things that are working, and it reminds me when I hear you say that, brag about how humble we are. Representative Trent Franks used to say to me, funny thing about humility, about the time you think you've reached it, you've lost it. And so I have to set humility aside and then talk about Iowa. But I have long said that Iowa is the best place in the world to live and raise a family. And I'm glad to see now that the formula that they used, I'm going to declare it to be an objective formula. I didn't look at the formula, I looked at the results.
You weren't elected to be impartial, that's for sure.
Well, no, but the people I represent also have a dose of humility within them. And so we'd like to be objective about, why did this come about this way? The number one thing has got to be education. Mm-hmm. And I say that because Iowa's educational system, we are dedicated to education. It's in our culture. 61% of our state budget is committed to education. I don't know if there's another state that commits a greater share of its state budget than Iowa does. And why is that? And I served 6 years in the Iowa Senate, and I got a pretty good feel for it there. But back in the day when Iowa was being settled, they set up country school districts that were 4 miles by 4 miles, generally speaking. There were variances. And so 16 square miles, and that land paid the taxes to hire the teacher, to build the country schoolhouse, to buy the books, to bring in the coal, carry out the clinkers, and sometimes that teacher was housed in a neighboring house and lived there. They started their dedication with really a public school system and a country school. And so people paid taxes into that. They could see that school from the plow, about anywhere in that school district. And as those districts were consolidated, the culture of being dedicated to education for all of our children in the neighborhood, we knew those children that were going into the country schools. I think that's a big foundational part of that. And then another second component of that is just the strength of our families. And all families, on balance across the country, have eroded over the last generation or two. But Iowa has held them together pretty well. An example I'd give would be my middle son, Mick, who just turned 40 years old here the other day. When he graduated from high school, it was a class of 36 students. And my wife and I knew all those kids in that class, of course, as you would in a small town. But 33 of the 36 students started their first day of kindergarten together.
Wow. And
that was unusual then, or I wouldn't remember it.
Now, a huge part of the Iowa success in education and overall is the sports. Did you see that in the state senate?
As I saw the sports in the state senate, we honored some of our champions that had done well, and you could just see the commitment that was there. But you see it all over the state, and the sports that we have, I think they do a tremendous job in knitting our communities together. When you see a school consolidation that's been taking place here incrementally as the population has really been stable, but it's been moving more to the cities, that's brought about some consolidation of schools. A lot of times, this is when the sparks fly, it's over the sports teams.
Yes.
And where you're going to go to watch football, where you're going to go to watch basketball, and what about the wrestling team? They don't have a good wrestling program over there, so surely we wouldn't want to consolidate with these neighbors. So those are some of the intensities that go on. The kids adapt to it more quickly than the parents do because the parents are entrenched in those traditions. And I do think those traditions are valuable. They need to be considered as well.
Now, there was a fantastic program on Iowa Public Television that I watched this week about Seymour, Iowa. The high school gymnasium was destroyed, and the girls' basketball team has had to play all away games. And all the other high schools have worked with them. And the truly incredible part is 4 years ago, the seniors did not win a game. This year, they're undefeated and on the way to the state championship. Do you think that would happen in any other state where the other schools would come together to help the champion beat them?
It's hard to say, but I think that reflects very much the rural culture and a rural atmosphere, and it also represents, I believe, the Midwest. We have Midwestern characteristics that run up and down throughout the Midwest, but we are in Iowa the heart of the heartland, and I often refer to us as that. And if you're going to go somewhere to find those kind of characteristics, it doesn't mean they don't exist elsewhere. It's just that would be the first place you'd look, would be Iowa, and especially rural Iowa for those circumstances.
And what are those characteristics?
Well, it's a sense of a community, but a sense of fair competition too. And the idea that when you look at your competing schools around, they've competed against each other now for multiple generations. And you're interrelated. You have family members and friends that are in other school districts. You look at that and you have empathy for what has happened there at Seymour. And I think it's a natural thing for them to pull that together. And who could say our gym's going to be too busy for you to come over and play basketball? I mean, I might be willing to say, why don't you have your home games on our court just as long as you're not playing against us? While that's the case, we'll invite 2 teams in to play on an empty gymnasium in the neighboring school.
Well, the scheduling was fortuitous because the other schools did not have any home games when they needed it, so that worked out well. But Senator Chaz Allen came to talk to my class, and he played football growing up in Iowa, and he said when he went to apply for a job at a grocery store in Long Island, New York, the guy looked at it and he said, "You played football in Iowa?" And he goes, "That's right." He goes, "When can you start work?" And the guy just said, "I just knew from your Iowa values and characteristics that you'd work out to be my best employee."
That is exactly true. Iowans do have, about anywhere in the country, even the world for that matter, if you have resumes that match up equal to each other, and the difference is one's an Iowan and one is not, you definitely have an advantage. To give an example of this, let me see. I was in Iraq. The first trip I made into Iraq.
Yes, sir.
And now I had to pause for a second while I pulled back the general's name, but everybody will recognize his name. He was a 1-star general at the time, commanded the 1st Armored Division in the northern part of Baghdad shortly after we arrived in there to liberate that country. I went in for a briefing. About a dozen members of Congress were there, and he had to delay his arrival because there was a mortar attack in the neighborhood. So we went in, and he came in, and the general came in and briefed us, and then we did the introductions on the way out. It was General Martin Dempsey, who later became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But on the way out, as a dozen of us walked out of that room, he introduced himself to each of us, and I'm about in the middle, say 6 on either side from all over America. I just said, "Steve King, Iowa." He took my hand and he pulled it in real tight, and he looked me right square in the eye and he said, "Keep sending me those good Iowa kids."
Now, do you think that's why Apple's putting in their new data center in Iowa?
Doesn't hurt, Jonathan. I think it does because we're dedicated to education and we have a good work ethic and we have a reputation for being honest and having strong families. You want those kind of wholesome people to come to work, and so that doesn't mean they aren't going to have to bring some folks into Iowa to fill up all the ranks of the people that they're going to hire there. But I think that's a significant part of it, and we can be a little more competitive tax-wise, and we've got some things we can do along that path. But one thing that we're doing is every General Assembly working to make Iowa better. And when I look at the best places in Iowa and I see where they get it right, you can go ask them, "How you doing?" And they will say, "Well, we're struggling with this, and we need to add these other components." And I listen to that and I realize that the reason that they're as good as they are is because they're constantly competing with each other and trying to make it better. You don't see it from the outside because you see excellence from the outside, but on the inside, they're struggling with each other to always try to make it better, and that's why it does get better.
Now, in the class, we talked about this competition that you just directed to, and we decided that, they don't give participant ribbons in soccer in Iowa City and Davenport maybe, but certainly not in Storm Lake. So do you see that back where you're coming from, to that level of competition through the ranks?
Well, there definitely is competition along the way, and that's one of the reasons we have such strong support for our high school teams, whatever they might be, whether it's the football team, the basketball team, the track team, the wrestling team, the volleyball team. That competition. One thing I'd see is that as I watch that, we raise our children to compete. I get a little disappointed when they get a participation ribbon in any category.
Oh, we lived in Montgomery County. We know about that.
But we raised them to compete. And I also think about when there was some young fathers that had little sons who were like 1.5 years, 2 years old, and they decided, we need to teach these kids how to wrestle.
Yes.
So they took up a collection and bought some extra mats and went in there and regularly worked those kids from, say, 2 years old on up and coached them in wrestling. Now I see that one of those kids brings his children to our church. And he's grown up now, and he's got his family, raising his own family. But he went on and wrestled in the state tournament, and they started him really, really young. These little tykes can hardly walk, and they're out there wrestling on the mat. And if there's anything that's competitive, it's high school wrestling.
What is it about Iowa that wrestling has such a strong grip on the sports culture?
Well, it's just been established there, and it's a individual team sport. And so even though whether the team is good or not, there's a lot of competition, of course.
Oh, yes.
An individual can excel on a wrestling team, even if the rest of the team doesn't excel. There's always the opportunity to excel and get better, and I think that's just been part of the culture. But it's a long-standing tradition that's just gotten better and better, and I think it's been reflected in the wrestling teams at the University of Iowa and, of course, Iowa State University. And I look around when I go to a ball game, and I meet people at football games at ISU, and I know we're a University of Iowa here. I don't make as many of those, and also at basketball games. And I see these gray-haired people with cauliflower ears. I don't have to ask them what they did in college.
Well, I remember the first day I worked into the bookstore at the University of Iowa, and prominently right there was Dan Gable's autobiography, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And talk about politicians, he hit both Iowa and Iowa State, so he can play both sides well.
He played them both so very well. And then I just think of the time that he had taken the Hawkeyes through 9 consecutive national championships. Then they had the Roman numeral 10 on their slinglets. And who was it that denied that 10th championship? It was Jim Gibbons and Iowa State University. So if that streak was going to end, it needed to end facing Iowa State University and no other. That kept it all within Iowa for another year as well.
Well, here's sort of a Sophie's Choice question for you. If I was wrestling Iowa State with Gable out there wrestling, who are you rooting for?
Well, I'd have to be for Iowa State because I represent Ames and Iowa State University, and our ties are stronger there. I root for both schools unless they're up against each other. And I don't like to equivocate going down the line on that. But our family is a little bit, we have Hawkeye fans in our family, and we've got Cyclone fans in our family. And there's just a nice, healthy rivalry, and I think it makes both schools better.
And one thing I have noticed is the strong high school sports culture in the state of Iowa. Do you think that's because there are no pro teams?
Well, I don't know that it's because there aren't pro teams in Iowa, because we have a Big 12 school and we have a Big 10 school. I don't know if there's another state that has that kind of a matchup where we're representing in 2 of the major conferences in the country. And then we look around us, and you go to Minneapolis for the Twins and Chicago for the Cubs. Not very many White Sox fans in Iowa, but a lot of Cubs fans.
Not after the Cubs won the World Series.
Royals fans in the South, yes. And but we were Cubs fans long before then. And so I don't know how much that affects our dedication to our high school sports. But I think our high school sports have just developed as the community, the thing that draws our communities together. And if you've got that to share, and you're watching your children and your grandchildren out there on the field or on the court, whatever they might be doing, or on the track, it pulls us all together. And what else draws the community together more strongly than your educational system, and what draws you more strongly within the educational system than the sports themselves?
Now, Representative Amy Nielsen, when she came to my class, she was very excited. She said they were having a new high school built in her district, and she said, I don't even like football that much, but I can't wait to go to Friday night to fire up the egg salad, fire up the casseroles, and head out to the games. What do you think it is about high school sports in Iowa that makes it special?
Well, it is the culture of that. And, when the air starts to get cool in the fall, and you have your first soap scrimmage that goes on, that the
What's a
season's
soap scrimmage?
Soap scrimmage is when we used to always be like the scrimmage between the teams. Say one high school team will have a little scrimmage against each other, say the first and second team, and we always called it the soap scrimmage. Everybody brings some soap and puts it in a pile. I don't know if they still do that or not, but it goes into the locker room for the season. Just a little thing there to help out that's probably rooted back in times when we didn't have the resources we have now. But that's kind of when it triggers the beginning of the season. And then as the weather cools, you start to think, Friday night's coming around.
Yes.
Is it a home game? Is it an away game? If it's an away game, do I have to quit work early to get there? And so I just, all of those years, and even today, as I travel around the 39 counties and 382 towns in the 4th Congressional District, and by the way, I've been to every single town in those 382 towns and visited people in them. But as I travel around there, I'll go to places like Harlan and Creston, and and of course Denison is where I went to high school, and Storm Lake is where I was born.
Yes.
And I meet people there that remember ball games, especially football
Sure.
games, from clear back
Sure.
decades ago, and basketball games when we're vying against each other to
Yes.
get into the state tournament. The drama of all of that gets in your blood, and there's really nothing better that I can think of as far as the joy in a sport than being there and seeing your high school team win a state championship.
Now, President Obama, he said nothing brings us together like sports. He said not politics, not business, nothing touches the heart like sports does.
I agree with him. I think it does. It touches our heart and it gets in our blood, and sometimes it gets a little too intense. But in the end, it brings us together in a way. And we should remember that sports are a microcosm of real life. That's why we're really so dedicated to the sports. When you look at little kids growing up and they start to compete, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, we should not insulate them from that. Let them understand that that's part of life too. And you learn to be a teammate. You learn to practice. You learn to sacrifice. And as Jim Jordan, a congressman from Ohio, which many by now know Jim Jordan.
Sure.
He was a national wrestling champion. And he said, nothing good comes without
Yes.
discipline. So sports bring discipline. They give denial, self-sacrifice, practice, training, and sore muscles and hard exercise and paying attention to being smart and playing smart. Life's a lot like that. And when we refer to, say, hard-working Iowans, you won't see that in my press releases because it's not enough any longer just to work hard. You also have to work smart. I want smart, hard-working Iowans, and that's the reason why Iowa was ranked #1 as the best place in the country to live, because it has about 3 million, most of whom are smart, hardworking Iowans that care about their faith, care about their families, they have discipline, and some of that, in fact, a lot of that they've learned by growing up through sports.
Now, you talk about your press releases in real life. How's the New Year's resolution to lose 10 pounds by Easter coming?
I think I'm going to be okay. One of the reasons I went public with that is so I would have discipline. And it's right, I ran myself across the scales last weekend, and I had already reached the goal. I had dropped 10 pounds from New Year's, and my promise was to get there by Easter. But I digressed a little bit and slid back a couple pounds. But I'm going to do the Iowa thing, and I'm going to be an overachiever here. I'm not going to settle for 10 only, not just squeaking in under the wire, but I'm going to make sure there's enough room that I don't have to say I fudged a little. I won't.
Well, now, here's a big question. As one who loves the food in the Midwest, are you spending all your time in D.C.? Because if you're passing up the Dundee burgers at Shorts in Iowa City and the cinnamon rolls at the Blueberry Cafeteria, that's very impressive. But passing up the swill here in the Rayburn Cafeteria, not so much. So are you just spending the whole time here in D.C.?
Well, no, I'm getting back home for the weekends, and it's important that I do that most weekends. But what I do, Jonathan, is
Yes, sir.
when at the beginning of Lent, I decided that I will, during the weekdays, and I give myself a pass on Sundays, but I just fast from midnight until 6:00 p.m. And it reminds me of the suffering that Christ went through during that 40 days and 40 nights. And if he could go through all of that, I can skip a meal till 6:00 at night and make weight by Easter. And so I made the promise to the public, and I made the promise to God, and I'm going to make it.
You know, one thing I think that makes you such an effective legislator, and one of the most effective I've seen in all the time I've worked up here, is you had real life experience running a business before you went into politics. What did you learn from running a business that's helped you become such an effective legislator?
Well, I told them that, I have a PhD from the University of Hard Knocks.
Yes.
And I started out, I borrowed 100% and bought an old beaten up bulldozer, welded on it for 2 weeks, and rolled it out to start making money. And 3 hours later, the engine blew up. And a week later, my wife is standing on the tracks of an old D7 in the rain with a 7-foot cheater pipe torquing the head bolts. And so that tells the whole story about where we got started. But I had to be my own mechanic, my own truck driver, my own equipment operator, my own marketer, my own human resources person, and I had to learn the insurance business and, of course, the banking business.
Sure.
and then the drainage business and all the things that you need to know to be effective in earth moving and in drainage work. And then we branched out into some concrete work, and we got more and more technical. I believe I did the first underwater grading by laser anywhere in the country that I know of, and I'm very confident it'd be true in the state of Iowa. So we were innovative in some ways, and all of that background gave me a spectrum of the necessary skill sets to keep a large business running. But anyone that goes into a large business doesn't have the opportunity to be forced to learn all of those components that I had to learn in order to keep the business up and running. So it's a broad variety of experience. We had a broad variety of equipment, and we took on a broad variety of projects. And that experience, and by the way, the weight of regulations was something that's been a reminder to me too, that I used to give seminars around in the states around the upper Midwest, and I would ask them, how many regulating agencies regulate your trade? And we came with kind of a consensus among the states that each business in a similar business as mine was having to deal with about 43 different agencies. And so I would say, I challenge you, there's not one private company anywhere in America that on their home website has a little banner that says, "Notice, we are in compliance with all federal regulations." Nobody will do that, Jonathan.
I can believe that. Now, David Lee Roth, when he was with Van Halen, he said the best business lesson he got from his father was to put in their contract that there were not supposed to be any brown M&Ms in the bowl, because if that was right, then that showed that they were following what they had in the contract. What's the best business lesson you've passed on to your children?
I think I would say to them, go memorize Kipling's poem, If. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, and if you can keep your head when others doubt you, and you have to make allowance for their doubting too, and it goes on down to the end, and it's, if you can do all of that, then you will be a man, my son. But it also applies to the women as well. And I think that would be the philosophy within that. And then I would say, get your faith right, get your work ethic right, get your family right, and then always remember that you have to have a sense of where you are and where you fit within this continuum, and you better carry a lot of humility with you. There's a lot of it dished out in this business.
Sure.
And yet you have to have the confidence to know that to move and take action when what you're doing is right. And I think of a ranger, a former ranger named his name is Dave Eubank. I met him in the jungles between Thailand and Laos, where he was carrying in survival packages and survival for the villages that were under assault over there, and they were being scrubbed out and annihilated. And I looked at the pictures, his wife and his 3 little children there, little blonde kids like that, and they stand out in the jungle. Everybody knows that, they aren't natives there. And I said to him, how can you keep going in here, especially with your family, and taking on this danger? I know you're helping people. I know you're saving lives. And he looked at me and he said, I've always believed that if what you're doing is true and right and just, you keep on doing it. And that's what we need to do here in Washington, and any job we have is if what we're doing is true and right and just, keep doing it.
Well, clearly it's working for you. You win re-election by record margins. You're the dean of the Iowa delegation to Congress. But it amazes me. I spent a long time up here in senior positions. I had top secret clearance twice, and in 2015, Inside Gov said you were the least effective legislator up here, which I thought was a huge joke. What are they missing about you? I mean, I see it. I was up here, like I said, long time, top secret clearance twice, degrees from Harvard, Hopkins, Georgetown Law School, thousands of publications. I'll put my background up against anyone who's ever worked for Inside Gov and saying you're one of the most effective legislators I've ever seen. What are they missing about you?
Well, I was so unimpressed with their opinion, I never really looked at their criteria. So I think they're measuring maybe the number of bills that are passed with one's name on them. That could be the only criteria that I can think of.
Do you think they ever mentioned once that there was never a full budget passed under Harry Reid when he was in charge of the Senate during the Obama administration?
Well, one might measure that to say he was effective in that because
Yes.
he was able to manipulate the legislature legislature takes.
And unconstitutional.
I agree. and so here's what they're missing, though, and that, to your question, is that when Jeff Flake ran for United States Senate, he had his staff run some numbers on the effectiveness of amendments, the amendment process. And in doing so, he uncovered my effectiveness. And it turns out that I had offered more amendments than, I believe, all but three. Maybe it was only all but two members of Congress. Jeff Flake was one of them. He offered more than I did. But I had the highest completion or the highest success percentage in those amendments.
Now that is very impressive.
So I'm going in against the leadership sometimes. They don't want to see those amendments come to the floor. It's not got the endorsement of leadership. But I'm bringing up these points and putting them in these pieces of legislation that need to be debated, even though it makes some people uncomfortable about the politics of it. And so, why do they work so hard to try to unseat me? If they think I'm not effective, they ought to be happy with that.
That's another very good point, too. I think one reason you represent your district so well in the terms of the sports culture is you're an outdoorsman. What is it about that section of the country that draws people from literally around the world?
Well, things that we have going on outdoors, the pheasant season has got to be the highest highlight that we have. And there's good duck hunting in Iowa, great deer hunting in Iowa. Shannon Bream of Fox News told me her husband was going to Iowa, this is a year or two ago, going to Iowa to try to bag a big buck.
You can run them over on Route 50 going to Annapolis in my home, that's for sure.
I saw two on the way to the airport yesterday morning.
Don't have to go to Iowa for
There's
that.
two we won't get to shoot or eat. but we have all kinds of outdoor sports. We've got great fishing in Iowa too. And I remember I had a fellow come up to, he's an author, he sings songs. His name is Brooke Turner, for our Christmas party. And he stood in there, and he's a rancher from down in southern Iowa. And he's wearing his blue jeans and his old beaten up black dirty cowboy hat. And he had his songs he'd written in this ring notebook with pages torn out. And he said to me, he said, I'm kind of uncomfortable around you Congress types here. I'm kind of a redneck guy, and I come out of the timber and the pasture and the cornfields, and you guys are all city folks. Well, it was
does
my
his
staff
research,
and family.
doesn't it? Yeah, does his research.
And so I said, well, let me see. Why don't you look down the folks sitting in those chairs, and I'll tell you who they are. This one here, this one, and this one. If you go out to their pickup now, there's a 5-gallon bucket in the back of it with their ice fishing gear in it.
Did you show them a picture of your wife 7 months pregnant welding the tractor by any chance?
I should have taken a picture of that. and then, and I said, that one, he's got a deer rack and head that he's going to get mounted sitting in the back of his. And I went on and described a little more of that. And I said, see that one over there? That's my daughter-in-law. And her brother has got a mossy oak tattoo. That's what did it. He was comfortable with us then because we were sufficiently redneck.
Let me ask you a question about, sort of small town Midwest. I was reading the New York Times, and they had articles about the curling team winning the first gold medal and the women's hockey team bringing home the gold medal to the United States. And as the New York Times called it, they said they're from small Midwestern towns. What do you think it is about that sort of condescending attitude from both coasts that, the Midwest is flyover country? Yeah, it's got great schools, great sports, gold medal winning athletes, and U.S. News and World Report just picked it out as the best state in the country, but they're small towns. Well, what do you think that attitude's from?
Well, we've picked it up for a long time, and there does seem to be an elitist attitude that emerges, especially in the heart of New York City itself. The upstate people are different, I think, and also that some of that exists within L.A. out west. But I'd say to them, try and compete with these kids and see what, their children are going into large schools with large classes, and when you think about it, there's only room for 5 out on the basketball court at any one time, 11 on the football field, 9 on the baseball team if you have one, and 6 out on the volleyball team. So we have kids that compete in 3 or 4 sports, and we have kids that will you might have the fullback that at halftime, he just puts the tuba up on top of his pads and goes out there and plays with the marching band. Yes. So the young people that are growing up in these small town and rural schools that we have, and they may only be 8-man football, but they get a chance to participate in everything. And you get recruited to be part of the debate team, part of the drama team, and the athletics and the academics. And so when you put that all together, the variety of experiences in the competitive atmosphere, academic and athletic, I think it gives our young people a leg up on those kids that are going to a school that still only gets 5 out on the basketball court at any one time.
Now, when you talk the culture of sports in Iowa, you have to talk Title IX. As Representative Jim Leach pointed out when he talked to my class, he said he thought Iowa was the most progressive state in the country. And Title IX has done wonders for women's sports. I think you've done wonders for women's sports too. You have a young chief of staff who's female.
I do. In fact, I believe she still is, the youngest chief of staff on the Hill. And Sarah Stevens is her name. I think she was 24 when I named her chief of staff.
And so what led you to pick her as chief of staff?
Pardon me?
What led you to pick her as chief of staff? What qualities?
Well, I needed a chief. The situation arose in that fashion. I was searching around through this stack of resumes, and the chief
no shortage
of
of
staff,
that.
it has to match. You can have highly skilled and well-educated people, but it has to match personality-wise too. You want somebody that thinks like you do, that's kind of an extension of yourself, that's intuitively bonded. And so as I'm sorting through these resumes and doing interviews and being somewhat disappointed that it didn't quite click, I'm processing in my own mind, when I find this right person, or when I settle on this person that I might not be convinced is right, I'm going to have Sarah Stevens train them. And so when that thought went through my head, it was pretty clear to me that Sarah needed to be chief of staff, and I have never regretted it for a minute.
And what do you think the overall impact of Title IX has been on sports in Iowa?
Well, I think one thing is that, of course, there's a lot more female participation in sports throughout our schools across the state, and that's been a good thing. It's given them an opportunity to compete at a high level where it hones their skills, not just not on the field or on the court, but honing their skills in such a way that they're preparing for the business world after that, for the job placements that come along, and preparing them for something that I'm jealous I'm never going to get to be, and that's to be a good mother that also trains your kids. And here's something else I picked up just the other day, Jonathan. I hadn't thought about this very much. I didn't read the article, just a headline, so I don't know what the details were underneath it, but it was this, that it's changed now in the country. Families used to prefer to have boys instead of girls. Now it's shifted, according to this article, the other way, where families prefer perhaps a girl rather than a boy. I understand that with granddaughters, and I didn't get a chance to raise any daughters, but I sure understand it with granddaughters. But here's the piece, is that you raise a girl now, telling her all the things she can do. You be all you can be, you can achieve anything you want to achieve. But the boys increasingly are being raised to be told what they can't do. And I've got to process that a little bit, but I thought that was a significant kind of a statement to make. The opportunity for young women in this country has gotten greater and greater, and Title IX has been a component of that I think has been a significant component.
Well, you're 100% correct, Congressman. As a result of Title IX, for the first time ever, there are more females in the first-year medical class this year. And Ernst & Young did a study that showed that 80% of the females in C-level jobs had high school or college sports backgrounds. So let me just ended up asking you one question about the great school system and the universities. Wallace Lowe, who used to be the provost at the University of Iowa and is now president of the University of Maryland, he said the athletic department is the front porch of the university because it's what shows it to the world. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. And that's why it's so important when you get into a bowl game, no matter what the bowl game is. You've got the whole nation watching at that period of time. You're recruiting to come in. It's the image of your sports teams that are there, the colors, the drama, Herky the Hawk and Cy. Those things, all those images, they say Iowa for us. And I even go back to these little towns around the state. When they had a good high school basketball team, even when it was 6-on-6, we learned where those towns were, and we picked up their names because they went out to the basketball court, and we watched the state tournament level. And so not only are athletics at the University of Iowa, Iowa State, UNI, and the rest of our fine institutions across the state, not only is it's the front porch is a way to describe that, but it's also true for our high schools as well. And those images will last for generations. And I can remember those teams that, used to call Montezuma would be one.
Right.
I don't go through Montezuma very much, but I remember their girls' basketball team.
Well, so when you talk about the bowl games, can you get me 2 tickets the next time they're in?
I could work on that.
I look forward to that, Congressman. Hawkeye Nation is
I've
in the house.
enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.